What's up, Stokers? Before we begin this podcast, I want to let you know that we will be at the Hollywood Improv Main Room on September 15th. That's a Wednesday at 8 p.m. Lineup is TBD, but it's going to be stacked because the Hollywood Improv, you know, they bring the big hitters. So we're trying to get the big headliners and, of course, Strider and Joe as well. So find the tickets at hollywoodimprov.com. Check us out. And we are also brought to you by the legends at Talkspace. Talkspace, we like to say no big, but the truth is little things can really add up, and suppressing emotions only gets you so far. I'm a big, I suppress my emotions a lot, and sometimes I got to talk about it, and I've gone to therapy a couple times, and I've talked it out, and it makes me feel so much better. It's just an orgasmic release of emotion, and I want the same for you. So match with a licensed therapist when you go to Talkspace.com. Get $100 off your first month with promo code GODEEP. That's $100 off when you use code GODEEP at Talkspace.com. We are also brought to you by the legends at Manscaped. Manscaped, thank you so much for keeping our trims pewed, for looking after our hogs, for making sure their dinks are looking fresh and clean, because these are the leaders in below the waist grooming. It's back to school time, and we want to make sure that you pack the essentials just to have the best year yet. The Manscaped 4th Generation Performance Package is just that. Things are opening up. Be ready for whatever is in the daily sketch for you. And it's the perfect package for your perfect package. And it includes the brand new Lawnmower 4.0. Fellas, go for the valedictorian wordplay of ball trimming and join the 2 million men worldwide who trust Manscaped by going to manscaped.com with the promo code GODEEP. Finally, we are brought to you by DraftKings. Oh, what? You trying to get on that sweet action? Yep, I'm trying to get on that sweet action, and you can do it with DraftKings. DraftKings is the official daily fantasy partner of the NFL, and now is the time to get in on the action. Download the DraftKings app and enter code DEEP. This week, new customers get a free shot at the $1 million top prize and compete for millions in prizes across all contests. Minimum $5 deposit required. That's code DEEP on the DraftKings app for a free shot at $1 million bones. Baby, that is what I like. We also have Helix beer bongs and merch at shopcgd.com. Make sure you check that out. All right, let's start the show. What's with deep? Going deep. Chad and JT. Sizzle up the pan and serve me a burger. What's up, Stokers of Stoke Nation? This is Chad Kroger coming in with the Going Deep with Chad and JT podcast. I got my compadre, Sean Thomas. What up?
Boom clap, Stokers.
And today we have with us our guest. She is a philosopher at the University of Chicago and author of the book Aspiration, Agnes Callard. Welcome. So pumped to have you on.
Thank you.
Did I get that the pronunciation correct? Callard? Awesome. Nice.
How's your day going?
Pretty good.
Nice. What do you do typically in a day?
Today, I've been just reading and rereading this one Platonic dialogue that I know super well. And I'm so frustrated by the fact that I still have to reread it at this point. But it's I'm writing about it, and the things that I'm saying about it don't exactly fit what it says. So I've had to reread it to pull myself into line.
What's the rub?
I don't understand.
What's different? Where's the discrepancy in what you're saying and what the Platonic dialogue says? So
it's a dialogue about this guy, this young sort of heartthrob named Alcibiades.
What a beast.
He's an up and coming successful person, right? So he's like the young elite. And this guy, Socrates, is a philosopher, old guy, has been hovering around him for years. And this kid, Alcibiades, maybe 19, 20, has just throngs of admirers. So Socrates has been hanging out in the outskirts of the admirers and watching as this kid turns everyone away and be like, I don't care about you, I don't care about you, right? And Socrates would be among the lower, lesser admirers, right? So he didn't dare approach Alcibiades, but this dialogue is about when he finally approaches him and walks up to him and has the guts to say hello to him and try to interest Alcibiades and what he has to offer, which is philosophy. So it's very dramatic. And the whole beginning is Alcibiades being like, yeah, I have been wondering, like, why you hang around me, and like, what are you doing, and why do you expect me to notice you, and by the end of it, Alcibiades is like, I'm going to throw myself at your feet, and I'm going to be your student, and you're going to be my teacher. So it's this sort of transformative thing where you watch Socrates do his magic.
Oh, wow.
How does he do that? What, just through the Socratic method, or how does he convince him that he's worthy enough to be his teacher?
Yeah, so like the first move that's really crucial is Socrates says to him, I know what you want secretly, Alcibiades. I'm the one who knows. He's like, I know the official story. The official story is that pretty soon you're going to present yourself to the Athenians as somebody who can give them advice, which in a democracy, that's sort of what power is like to be the guy that people will listen to for advice, right? And he's like, you really want like political power, but the thing I know about you is, suppose that you could rule over the Athenians, suppose that you really got sway over Athens, but you couldn't rule over the Spartans. So you couldn't rule over like all the Greeks, just the Athenians. You would rather die than be limited to only the Athenians. And suppose you got the Athenians and the Spartans, but not the Persians. Suppose the Persians weren't listening to you. You couldn't rule over them. You would rather die. The thing you want, Alcibiades, is to rule over the whole world. And unless you can get that, you will think your life is not worth living. And he's like, I'm going to tell you that because I'm the one who understands that about you. And it's totally true. And Alcibiades is like, not that I'm going to say that that's true, but suppose it were true. Why would I be interested in you? Right.
Right.
So that's like Socrates' first move, is to intuit something deep about Alcibiades' motivations that nobody has really understood before about him, and something that Alcibiades views as like something you kind of can't say.
So what's Socrates' motivation for doing that? Just to have kind of power over this other person who has power? Or is it because he really admires the kid and he wants him to kind of reach his full potential? Or both?
I think it's what Socrates says is that it's because you have this ambition that I'm interested in talking to you. That is, I want to talk to people who want to rule over the world, because the people who only want to rule over Athens, that's like nothing to me. Like those people, like they don't have, one way to put it would be, there's a point in later in the dialogue when Alcibiades is having a lot of trouble answering Socrates' questions, and Alcibiades like gets a bit petulant, and he's like, yeah, but I don't think anyone else can answer these questions either. It's not like my fault or something. And Socrates is able to say, I'm ashamed of you for comparing yourself to those other people, the people who don't even care about ruling over the world. And Alcibiades is like, you're right. Like he's able to leverage off of Alcibiades' massive kind of world destroying ambition to insist that Alcibiades has to become the sort of person who would be worthy of ruling over the world. And that's the sort of person who really has to grab for the kind of knowledge that Socrates thinks people should want to have.
Right. How would you recommend for the novice, for the philosophical novice, how would you recommend they approach these texts? Because, for example, and I majored in philosophy, so I should, but like last year I read Meditations and some in Plato and stuff, and it's so dense. And I think part of me was like, part of me was sort of like this thing of like, I want to finish the book just to say I finished the book, But then the way I was reading it, I was like, I feel like I'm not reading this in the correct way, because I feel like I'm reading it more as a novel than a philosophical text. I guess, so how would you recommend people approach these books? Does that make sense?
First of all, yeah. I think wanting to finish the book to say that you finished it is a great motivation. And people need to listen to motivations like that, because anytime you're trying to do something where part of what you're doing in doing the thing is learning how to appreciate and enjoy the thing, you're not going to appreciate it or enjoy it that much at the beginning, right? So something has to keep you going.
Right.
So the idea of like having a benchmark, like this is an achievement to have read Descartes' Meditations, which it is. And I think Descartes' Meditations, especially the like first two, have this really nice narrative element to them that does help pull you through. And I don't think there's anything wrong. And the Socratic dialogues are even more of a narrative element. Most philosophy doesn't have that.
Yeah.
But I think so. I don't think there's anything wrong in allowing yourself to be pulled along by the narrative, and or even to selecting Socratic dialogues that have more of a narrative element to them. But I think, you were saying you felt like maybe you didn't get everything out of it that you could have. I'm sure that's true. As I was just saying, I was rereading the Alcibiades for the 1000th time today, right?
Right.
But I think so. So the real question is not, are you leaving anything behind? But you are. But how can you get as much as possible out of it? And I think, and like, how can you be doing more than just saying to yourself, I will have finished this? That is, I think it's not a bad start to say, I want to be able to say that I read this. But you want to try to do a little more than that. My experience, and this isn't like, probably not true of everyone, but that reading books with other people is the key. So having, like, people often ask me like, what should I read, what dialogue, whatever, and I say whatever you can get a group of people to agree to. So if it's a particular Platonic dialogue that the others want to read that one. If it's a novel, read the novel together and talk about it philosophically. I think you'll often get more philosophy done talking about a novel with other people than reading a book of philosophy by yourself. I think that one thing that happens is that we all have like major blind spots when it comes to philosophical thinking. That is, there's just assumptions we make that we don't notice that we're making, and we don't know how to question them. But other people are great at questioning them. So someone will ask you a question and you'll be like, oh yeah, how did I not ever think of that? So that's generally, it's what I do. It's what I still do with reading Platonic dialogues. I was talking about the Alcibiades with someone like 10 minutes ago. I think that one thing that a philosophical text reveals to pretty much everyone who reads it is their own lack of intellectual self-sufficiency.
Oh, wow. That's so true. I think what also you just did right there, though, but talking about Alcibiades and Socrates, is you put it into like a very relatable human narrative that, like, I was like, oh, now I get it. I was interested in it less for even like what they were saying, but like the game between them. So I think if I had more of a context for that. Well, and what ended up happening to Alcibiades? Did he end up ruling the world?
Yeah. No, he ended up ruining the world, basically. He ended up so he basically did rise to power among the Athenians, but then there was a scandal and he was disgraced, and he went over to the Spartans, and then he betrayed the Spartans and went to the Persians, and then he betrayed the Persians and went back to the Spartans. I'm really bad at remembering the details of history, so there are moments when I can remember this whole narrative, and now is not one of them. But he's basically kind of exhibit A for the case against Socrates. That is, Socrates, the end of the story of Socrates is that the Athenians put him on trial for corrupting the youth and for impiety. And who are they thinking of? Alcibiades, because he was a golden boy, right?
And so that really was an intellectual corruption. It didn't have anything. There was no other components to it. It was just you put bad ideas in young people and they went off and created evil out of it or something like that.
Yeah, basically. So one thing that's super interesting is that Socrates didn't write anything down, but his student Plato wrote these dialogues, and Plato was not the only one. Socrates was a major inspirational figure in his time, so lots of people wrote Socratic dialogues. They didn't all survive. So what survived was Plato's dialogues, and then Xenophon, who also wrote Platonic dialogues. But it's that is, he wrote Socratic dialogues, dialogues that feature Socrates. But the point is that was like a thing to do at the time, because Socrates was such a phenomenon, right? It was to write up these dialogues with Socrates talking to some guy, because Socrates didn't write anything down himself. Okay, so when Plato is writing, so he's Socratic dialogues, he's also thinking about sort of the rehabilitation of Socrates, right? And the defense of Socrates in a culture that has decided to put him to death. So of course, Plato
change the narrative a little bit.
Exactly, right? So Plato is going to have Alcibiades show up in dialogues, right? And have you watch what Socrates is doing to Alcibiades, so you can judge for yourself. Do you think this is corrupting or not? And one of the really interesting things that Plato has Alcibiades do in a different dialogue called the Symposium, Alcibiades shows up. He basically crashes a dinner party. So they're all having this dinner party, drinking, but they're not drinking much. Normally they drink a lot, but Socrates has said, let's not drink so much so we can talk philosophy. They're talking about love and sex. And Alcibiades comes in after they've all given a bunch of speeches, and Alcibiades like, I'm going to give a speech about Socrates. I'm going to tell you the truth about Socrates. And among the other truths that he wants to tell, there's this super poignant story about basically how Alcibiades ended up trying to seduce Socrates. So this is a culture in which older men are regularly seducing younger men, right? Pederasty, that's like a cultural institution. All those admirers of Alcibiades, these were like older men who were into him, right? And that's what Alcibiades thought Socrates was too, right? And once Alcibiades comes to admire Socrates, he's like trying to seduce Socrates.
He doesn't do it.
And Socrates is like resistant, and in fact it goes it like keeps escalating, right? There's like a point where Alcibiades is like, I invited him to dinner as though I were the older man and he were the younger one, you know? And the first he didn't even come, and then he came, but then he left right away after dinner. And then the second time I got him to stick around for a little while. And the third time I got him to stay really late so that he had to sleep over. And, you know, and so he lay down on the couch, and like I try to lay down next to him, and I say, Socrates, you know, with other men, I would be ashamed to be their lover, but with you, I'd be more ashamed not to be your lover because you're so wise. And Socrates responds, if I'm really as wise as you think I am, then, you know, trading me sex for that is a bad deal. Like, knowledge is worth way more than sex.
Oh, powerful man. Yeah.
And
Socrates has game.
Basically rejects him, right? But Socrates is like, you know, and he tries to make moves on Socrates, and Socrates is just like, he just lies there. And then of course Alcibiades becomes even more you know, kind of enamored of Socrates.
Right, of course.
Incredible self-restraint that Socrates
that which
has.
he can't possess. Yeah.
Exactly. And Socrates is like, look, let's always do philosophy together. Let's always like you know, proceed by agreement, the two of us.
Let's be friends.
And I think exactly. So you know, the idea of platonic, right?
Right.
And I think that you know, what like one question of course there is like, why is Plato telling this story, right? Why is Plato having Alcibiades show up in his dialogue and tell a story about Socrates? Well, Plato wants to tell his reader Socrates wasn't walking around seducing these guys. He was just doing philosophy with them, right? That's a good way to do that, is to have that
character testimony. Yeah.
Exactly.
Oh, that's so interesting. So when Alcibiades went out there and was betraying these different states or nations, like, did Socrates feel a responsibility for those kind of not moral acts, or did he detach a lot from whatever his students did?
We don't
have much insight onto like how he felt.
We know. Like, I think that some of what is going on in the symposium is Plato saying it wasn't Socrates' fault. That is, Plato saying Socrates did everything he could to try to pull Alcibiades away from the pursuit of honor and political power. And Alcibiades kind of kept resisting it. And that's the narrative, in effect, that Alcibiades himself tells at the end of the symposium. So I feel like we have a kind of, we have a Platonic line on this question, sort of, but we don't have anything more direct about what, you know, there's another passage that could be relevant. So in another dialogue called the Theaetetus, you have Socrates talking in very abstract terms about how the people that he talks to often leave him too soon. Like, so that would be a sort of complaint of like, no, I would have gotten them to, you know, I would have gotten them to an uncorrupted state, but they had to stick with me longer. It's almost like if you shake the foundations of someone's basic beliefs, right? And then they go away from you at that stage before they've acquired newly stable like beliefs. That would be one sort of thought of like what about the effect of Socrates on people, on people who are sort of half formed by him.
Nice.
Do you have another question about?
No. I was going in a different direction.
Yeah, on Ezra Klein's podcast, you talked about how the process of self-creation involved a lot of self-violence towards ourselves, and I'm incredibly hard on myself. And I was sort of wondering, when do you think that crosses the line from very beneficial to harmful? Do you have an idea of where that would be?
Yeah, I do think that um, one thing, um, maybe a background thing to keep in mind is like um, I think we secretly or something think it's perfectly fine to be mean and horrible and vicious and cruel to someone as long as that person is yourself, right?
Hmm.
So we treat ourselves in ways that we would see as morally unacceptable were we to treat another person that way.
Right.
And we don't even, and we might say to somebody who was doing that, we might be like, don't be so hard on yourself, but we wouldn't like censure them in the really serious way that we would if that person were treating another person that way, right? And you might think it's just as morally serious.
Yeah.
So I think that there's a real danger here, like that in some sense, our alert system or something, like you're doing something evil, doesn't go off when the target is yourself.
Right.
And now I think self-creation, yeah, so I think that, you know, as a what happens is like as you're growing up, like as a teenager or something, you have to learn to like fit into the world somehow, right? And you
Mhm.
have to kind of um, modify and experiment. And it's not true that the world is just going to accommodate you in every respect, right?
Yeah.
And it's sort of like, it depends, I think, how much of that you have to do. Both depends on just how weird you start out being and also how intractable some of your weirdnesses are.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's like it's like a process of trial and error. Like here's an example that I was talking about with someone yesterday. So like when I was around 13, 14, I noticed that like if I was in like group dinners, especially ones that were not with my family, but even to some degree also with my family, I would often get like a really bad stomach ache.
Mhm.
And like it was just really hard for me to eat with other people, especially with like larger groups of other people, like more than one other person, right?
Mm.
And it would just happen really frequently that I'd like get this terrible stomach ache while eating. And I learned that there's a thing I could do that would immediately resolve the stomach ache, which is lie down on the floor on my back.
Mhm.
In
Here's
front of everyone? Or would you steal away to your room or something?
okay. So sometimes we'd be like at a restaurant or whatever. Now my initial thing was like I would just lie down on the floor wherever I was. But
Smart.
I learned that this is not socially acceptable. You just can't do it, right?
It's a power move, though. It's a good status move to be like, I don't care.
I mean, initially it was like as soon as I figured this out, I'm like, this is great. I've solved this like terrible problem, right? But I then learned like you just can't do it. I would sometimes like we'd be in a restaurant and I'd go on in the car and like I'd lie on the floor in the car or something.
Mhm.
But I was like, that doesn't work. Like it's a solution, and it's a solution. Like if I'm at home or whatever, my stomach's returning, that my kids don't care, whatever, I can lie on the floor. If I can sometimes like go and retreat to my room. But there was like, I had a problem, I had a solution, but I couldn't apply the solution. So then over the years, this problem could persist to this day. I have developed like all these other solutions, right? So like another solution I've found is leaving the dinner. So like I can tell that I'm starting to get a stomach ache and I'll just be like, I have to go. And here's the thing I've learned, which I wouldn't have known going into this, I would not have been able to predict this, but people are less offended if you say, I need to leave this dinner than if you lie down on the floor. So
Mhm.
leave the dinner is better option. That for me, that's just experimentation to learn that.
Right.
But they are a bit offended. Like it's not great to have to say I have to leave, right? And so I spent a lot of time with just a lot of stomach ache, just sitting there having a horrible stomach ache, in pain, like literally in physical pain, right? Because I hadn't yet figured out the just walk away option. And then even nowadays, I still have since like give a talk. There's a dinner after the talk, right? It's a problem I still have. But I've learned other things like the more I control the conversation, the less of a stomach ache I get. Right now, is it always okay to control the conversation? No, right? So that's a strategy I can't always completely employ. The more that I'm talking to someone who is sitting either to my right or to my left rather than directly in front of me, okay. But I have like 100 things, like 100 little like tips and tricks, right, for dealing with group dinners, which is like just a standing problem for me. And at the early days, like there was just a lot of sitting in pain, right, or people getting really annoyed at me and freaked out because I'm lying on the floor, right. And like, I have to learn to accommodate to a world that, you know, finds some of my initial ways of dealing with this to be off-putting or weird. And I was pretty much already labeled a weirdo, but it's like you don't want to upset people, you know.
You
And it
wanted everyone
actually,
to have a good time. You didn't want to
yeah,
like
you
throw the
want
whole
them to,
thing
like, you
off.
want them to not be
Yeah.
like totally thrown. And like, I mean, I'm just telling you, if you haven't tried it, if you literally try and lie down on the floor at a dinner, people are just really thrown by that, like in a way that like I wouldn't have predicted going into it, but they are, just as a psychological fact. You just can't do it. Um, so so the point is, it's like trial and error to learn, for me, to learn what's going to freak people out. I often don't find it that easy to predict. And so I have to like go through, right? And experiment and try different things. And then in a given dinner, it's always also, it's just like a balancing act of experimentation. And then at some point it fails. And I say, I just have to leave this dinner, and I leave. You know,
Right.
so it's like, how long can I hold out?
But you go through your checklist, and the bottom one is just bail.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think what I like so much about your work too is that you talk about all these things that are like, I think we kind of categorize as negative emotions or something like that, or negative impulses. But you do a good job of like creating kind of like a looking at the positive benefits of these emotions. Or you said this other thing about like not actually being okay with who you are at a young age, because you shouldn't accept yourself as like an unfinished product. And I think so much of what we preach is like, hey, just accept yourself, just accept yourself. But I was fundamentally, like Chad was talking about, we're both pretty hard on ourselves. I was fundamentally incapable of doing that. But I also think it was coming from a kind of noble place where I was like, I'm not where I want to be. You know, I'm still not. But I was like, and I think it had someone framed it that way, so it didn't feel like I just hated myself. I would have been like, oh, okay, this is just like a stage in my development.
Yeah. So I think that one big lie that we tell ourselves is like, don't base your self-worth on what other people think about you. There's nothing you can base your self-worth on other than what other people think about you, because
Right.
you can't actually like decide how much you're worth. It's like, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
It's like making a promise to yourself. Can you make a promise to yourself? Like, you can say the words, I promise to you, but like, I can release myself from any promise that I promised to myself. It's not really a promise. And so similarly, you can't evaluate yourself and the worth. Like, what would you be selling yourself for? You know, it's like, you are yourself. It's your whole thing, right? And so like, you can maybe not care that much. You can come, I think, at some point, like to care a little bit less about the question, how much am I worth? But insofar as you care about that, what you care about is other people's opinion of you. And it's really hugely important that human beings care about other people's opinion of them. If they didn't, we would just have no educational prospect at all, right? Like, no, like people are not good as they start, right? That's why we have to educate them. And the mechanism of that is people caring about what other people think about them. And that's what self-worth is the sense of you have of your worth that's filtered through the judgments of other people, sometimes quite indirectly, right? It's sometimes like, I'm trying to impress, you know, I'm often trying to impress an image I have of a particular teacher that I had as an undergrad, and she's always there in the classroom with me, watching me, and I'm like trying to impress her in my head, right? But you know, as a younger person, I was just trying to impress the actual her, right? I didn't yet have her as an image in my head. So I think that there is really there might be some very unusual people, but for most of us, what it is to aspire to be better is like is to kind of push off of the judgments of other people and sort of to pull ourselves up to a higher place.
And how do you do this in sort of the correct way? Because you always hear about people like the kind of that don't give a fuck people, who those are the ones who get the most acceptance. Those are the ones who sort of, you know, in the eyes of other people, they're the ones who sort of rise because their indifference is so kind of attractive.
I think that sort of aspiration, which is to say trying to be like a better person than the person that you are, specifically in terms of coming to value new things, is profoundly uncool, right? So it means like you're not okay, and you're not okay with who you are, and you know, you're defective, and you recognize that you're defective. And so those are never going to be the most like attractive people, because like they do care what other people think about them, because they can't rely on their own judgment, because they don't even trust their own judgment. So you know, so people, I think, often, even when they are aspiring, like to pretend that they're not. So like, here's the thing I've noticed about students. students care a lot what I think about them. They care a lot how well I think their paper was written, and like whether I thought it was insightful, and whether I think they're smart, and whether I think they're making good comments. They care about all those things, but they pretend like they only care about their grade.
Right.
Quite often, right? Because it's sort of easier to admit that you care in some instrumental way about a grade and its role in your success than to admit that like you are vulnerable to the judgment of another person as regards your worth. And so the people who like are indifferent and cool are the people who are signaling that they are not aspirants, that they're not trying to be anything other than what they are, which is a way of trying to convey, I'm already at the top, I'm already there, unlike the rest of you suckers who are still trying.
Yeah, that's interesting. That makes me think of like the way I was growing up. I was the youngest of 5. And I think my way of asserting my dominance over my siblings was by feigning this indifference or this coolness. Like, oh, you guys are ambitious, but I party, But I think that was just just sort of how I, my way of sort of asserting my status within them, of being like, well, I don't care. So this is how much I don't care. So that's why I'm more important, or not more important, but like, that's how I earned my spot at the table. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, and you have autonomy in that value system too, where you're like, hey, that's what you guys value, but I have different values, and I actually think my values are better because I have more excitement, more fun. Like you guys are caught up in like a rat race, and I'm fucking chilling.
And I'm not scared of dad, even though I was terrified.
Right. Right. And the person you allocate status to, I don't need. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I also think it's like, in a way, it's a very much of a power move to claim indifference to the forms of value that other people are pursuing, right? Like that stuff doesn't even matter to me. So I'm not failing at your game. I'm just playing a different game.
Right.
How useful and how accurate do you think like alpha and beta kind of categorizations are?
So this is like sort of like alpha male, beta male, where the alpha male is sort of more ambitious and
more dominant.
More dominant. Yeah.
More admirable.
I think that I guess I sort of, if I now try to apply that framework to people in my life, I sort of can. So I think it probably has some purchase, but it's one of these things where I suspect that if I tried to press hard on it and really get clear on it, it would then dissolve. Like I feel that way about introvert and extrovert,
totally.
Like people like there's like, you can sort of, if you're doing it very quickly, you could be like, oh, I know these people are introverts, these people are extroverts, right? But then you actually kind of, I spent a while thinking about extrovert and introvert. Like I often want to run away from other people and like want to be alone, but I actually think I'm more of an extrovert in a lot of ways. I really like public speaking, and so when I try to like think hard about it, I kind of ended up tying myself in knots and being like, everyone is kind of both in different ways and in different constellations of people. And so I sort of on a first blush, I'm like, yeah, I can sort of categorize people in this way of being more dominant and being more submissive. But I sort of wonder whether if I tried to push hard on it, it would collapse in the way that extrovert and introvert does.
It lacks a lot of nuance.
Well, like, so here's an interesting case. Like, I think a lot of the people that we think of as alphas are people who take on recognizable positions of leadership within organizations that are in their community in one way or another, right? So, they sort of rise to preeminence in this whatever sphere is allotted. And I know people who are absolutely allergic to any of that and have no interest in it, but it's because like that just seems too small to them. Like even running a university, which would be like, that's pretty high, right? They might just be like, yeah, why do I want to run a university? Like I want to like discover the next big thing, like about the whole world, and so there's a kind of Alcibiadianism, right? Where in effect, any form of power would be too small for you. And that's a form of alpha, but it's not going to manifest as like becoming the president of some board or some group or some whatever, right? And so there's a way in which the question is almost like, in what sphere do you want to dominate? And are you content to dominate sort of like in the contingent community that you're a part of, or is that always going to not satisfy you somehow?
Interesting.
Yeah, that's like in high school, I played water polo. And I had no interest in the team's success. I honestly thought it was like uncool to want to win. I was like, you guys are all losers.
You did not buy in. Yeah.
It wasn't that harsh. But I'm like, who gives a shit? But now I'm starting to think because I think I just had. I guess this isn't a question, more of an observation. But I think it's just because I had different aspirations. So that is interesting. That you know, it is very nuanced, and it's like.
Here's an example from my life. So I was on the debate team in high school. Okay.
Right.
And I joined in my freshman year and I was super, super into it. I like read all this philosophy for the first time in order to use it in debate. I was very devoted, like member of the team. By my senior year, I was captain of the team, but I was not good at debate in the traditional sense of winning rounds of debate. Right. I mean, maybe I won 50% of them, but maybe less than 50%. Okay. And I'm debating against people who are not nearly as invested as me. Right. So I'm like trying super, super hard. They're like, maybe this is their first tournament or ever. And I still managed to lose to them. Yeah. And all the other people on my team who were super into it, I had my high school, like it was a really good team. They were really strong. People who are really into it were people who are really successful. And like, I wanted to be successful and I wasn't. But I also my place in my team really mattered to me. It's like being captain of the team, being in charge. I was really good at teaching the new people, like the new recruits, how to do debate. Despite the fact that I wasn't myself that good at it, I was good at teaching others. And like I was very invested in my role, and I wasn't that upset about my record as a like loser of debate, right? And so I saw myself as having like being dominating in one sense of dominating, right? Even though in another very natural sense of dominating, I wasn't dominating at all.
Right.
And do you think like the quest for status is about control, like about being able to dictate what the terms of the world around you are, or do you think it's just about like I don't know, some like biological reproductive need or something like that? Like what are the, besides needing a system to self-evaluate our own worth, like what is the aspiration to status? What does it give us?
So I really think that the thing about needing the thing to evaluate our own worth is the main part. That is, I think a lot of the time you're going to understand the concept of status better if you use a different word, if you use the word honor.
Oh, that's a better word for sure.
And one thing that the word status does is it's alienating. So the word status tends to be used of a certain system of valuation and estimation by people who don't buy into it, right? So it's like if I'm talking about like the status relations among some group of humans, like, oh, they're such idiots that they think this is important, right? That's the point of view of status, is the external point of view. But if I'm like, here's an honor that I really want, where that's a recognition of others for who I am and what I've achieved, right? That it's the same idea, it's just from the inside instead of from the outside. And I think you understand it much better if you think about it from the inside. So we all have forms of being recognized and being honored and being kind of credited that feel very genuine to us and are genuinely important to us. And that's the place to understand status. And I think why that's important is like that you cannot evaluate yourself, so you rely on other people. And it's also that it's really important to us, I think, to collaboratively and in a community way value things together. So like some of what honoring is doing is saying like we as a community value this thing together. And so not being honored in that way can feel very lonely and isolating. It's like there's things I value, but I value them all by myself and no one's doing it with me. So I think those are the fundamental like roles of status, is like getting a sort of evaluation of you that feels authentic and real and sharing the value of things with others. I do think you're right that achieving a certain level of recognition and sort of power in your life allows you to control things much more. And that's not insignificant. You know, it's a lot easier for me to walk out of a dinner now than it was when I was 16.
What motivated you to walk out was, I perceived it as part of the fact that because like, and you said one of the correctives to it was talking. I felt like the reason you wanted to walk out is because you're like, yo, I should be in charge of this dinner and I'm not. So I just want to bounce now.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was like, it took me actually a really long time to learn that my speaking had any effect on it. Like that was years, right? This took me a very long time to figure out. It was all just like, cause I didn't know anyone else who was like this. And I thought it was a medical problem at first. I went to so many doctors. Like, I'm like, oh,
Right.
there's something wrong with my stomach,
You're like, I shouldn't
and
drink milk or something.
yeah, no, absolutely. I stopped milk for a while, thought maybe it was gluten. Like it took me the longest time to realize that it was like other people, like that it was the
Right.
social exchange, right? That took forever to figure out. So, and then the idea that like if I would commandeer the conversation, that had a positive effect. I mean, I was definitely it was a decade or something before I got to that point of understanding the thing. I definitely generally like to commandeer conversations. It's not like
No,
that.
you
I
and
knew
me
that
both,
about myself.
sister. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's like what it's.
It's the best.
I'm puzzled by anyone who doesn't, right?
Yeah.
But I didn't understand that would have an actual effect in the social exchange. But I think it's more like it takes a certain kind of confidence to just say to people like, I just have to go. And it took me a long time to summon that. Like, and you think some horrible thing's gonna happen, but nothing happens. Actually, they're just like, okay.
What do you think about going back to the honor and sort of being recognized by society and stuff? What do you think about people who reach like the heights of fame and wealth who are incredibly unhappy? What do you think is the cause of that unhappiness? If they have all of the honor and sort of status that we sort of fundamentally crave?
That's a fire question.
Yeah, it's a great question. So first of all, I think notice that in the case of those people, it becomes very hard to exclusively use the word honor, and I don't think that they would use it.
Right.
I think that what they get is a kind of attention, let's say, that even they would say is not underwritten by their virtues.
Right.
It's
okay.
almost like there's an attention that feeds on itself, right? And so one thing is they can no longer actually really treat it as like a sign of their worth, because they know that it's like a kind of excessive, and I think that's especially true of if you're a kind of celebrity who is not really a celebrity because of what you take to be your talents or something. And I mean, which celebrity really is, even like in terms of to the extent of how much celebrity they have, right? It's not proportional, even if they have talents. And so I think that in fact, fame, both great fame and great wealth tend to be destructive of people. They tend to be psychologically destructive. So in general, things that make you happy often make you unhappy when you get too much of them. Right. And so most things in your life, you do not want to try to maximize, right? Like you want to have some kids maybe, but not like as many as possible, right? And I think the same thing is true of fame. And I think especially fame takes weird turns when it goes up a few orders of magnitude. I mean, I can't imagine being the sort of person who can't like leave their house without people like looking at you and taking pictures of you. And I was at a restaurant, like, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago with Matt Damon, was at a table like right next to me. And like really pretty close to me. And like, I kind of like kept on trying to touch him. And I was like, I just really want to touch Matt Damon. My husband was like, do not touch him. That's assault, And I'm like, that's Matt Damon. I have to touch him. I'm like, how insane am I, right? Like trying to touch this stranger man. And now imagine being Matt Damon. You're walking around, strangers trying to touch you, right? So I think that that's like a thing. People go a little bit nuts, right? And that's not a good way to live. It's not a human way to live. It's bad for your kids. So I think that having the kind of recognition that you can properly classify as honor is definitely can be really good for a person. But once it escalates to fame and kind of mere status, then that very emptiness, I think, is corrupting for people.
So was you trying to touch Matt Damon that sprung up for me some of your talks on jealousy and stuff like that? So your husband wasn't jealous in that instance?
He wasn't jealous.
He just didn't want you to violate like social
code. Yeah. He's like, poor Matt Damon, like leave him alone. He's just trying to eat his lunch.
Right. And then, but you said something so interesting about how polyamory and monogamy are both kind of constricted by the the same issue of jealousy, and one is like the explored version and one is like the unexplored version, but they're both like kind of not equally powerful, but they both take effect in both relationships. Could you kind of explain that idea of polyamory and monogamy and how jealousy plays a factor in both?
Yeah, I mean, here's one quick gloss that doesn't quite answer the last bit of the question, but we can go back to it. Is, a lot of times people talk about monogamy. They really mean polyamory. They just mean serial polyamory, right? So what they mean is like you're only with one person at a time, then you break up with that person, then you find another person, right?
Right.
And like over like a series of like many years, that's polyamory, right? You love many people just over time, not at one time. And you might
no
ask,
overlap.
like,
Yeah.
Right, and no overlap, right?
There's
and you might
honor
ask,
in
like,
the no overlap.
Like what? Like suppose that over 5 years you dated like one woman a year, right? Versus you dated 5 women for 5 years. Like we have this feeling like those are so hugely different. Like one is polyamory, right? And the other is like, oh, you're monogamous. But it's like, in a way, they're not that different, right?
Right.
So I think
but it feels nice when you feel like you're abiding by the monogamous ideal, even if it is some kind of distorted version of polyamory.
Absolutely. We have conventions, right? And those conventions then feel really natural to us. And if we were living at another time, the conventions might say you cannot just like date a woman for a year and then date another woman, right? That's like so promiscuous, right? But the point is just, I think one thing is that it's really important to us to constrain sexuality. Like sexuality is one of the things about ourselves where we don't understand it. It's super powerful. We're terrified of it. We're not sure why we are into it. Like there's of course a pure pleasure element to it, but the pure pleasure element doesn't capture like the depth of the psychology of it. And like, why aren't we just masturbating? Like, why do we need to have sex with people, right? Like there's clearly this deep psychodynamic element of sexuality that nobody really understands. And we kind of just want to step back away from and be like, at least I can confine it and constrain it somehow. And I think monogamy is a way of confining it and constraining it so we feel more comfortable about it. Sleeping with a different woman every night, as opposed to sleeping with the same woman every night, the different woman every night feels more unconstrained. It feels more like you haven't put any bounds on yourself, right? And so that feels like dangerous. And I do think that the project of constraining sexuality is both hugely important to human beings and has created so much suffering, right? So like, the project of constraining sexuality is like why there was a taboo against homosexuality for so long. Because we have this idea, like you can't just have like anything goes in sexuality, right? And so I think we're still figuring that out. Now, in terms of the sort of deeper polyamory, like what would the deeper polyamory be? And I think that, one thing that seems to me to be a sort of not very deep polyamory is like, suppose you just have these two relationships and they're really just isolated from one another, right? That really to me is a lot like serial monogamy, right? But what would become interesting, right, is imagine if you had kids like that, right? So like I have 2 kids. Imagine if I had them sort of separately. They lived in separate houses and I parented one some of the time and I parented the other another of the time, right? It's very different for them to be siblings, right? So I guess like, the broader thought of polyamory would be that there would somehow be a kind of cultural component to it. Now, how, if both the like husbands and the wives have like multiple husbands and wives, like how do you create a group, right? I don't know the answer. And so it's not obvious that you can, like, maybe there is no way to make that a kind of cultural phenomenon, right? And maybe a big part of why we have monogamy norms is that I just learned this recently on Twitter, is that like, if you go back, I don't know, 10,000 years or something, very few of the men were reproducing.
Like the strongest guys were getting all the women, right? And it was creating a lot of violence because these guys who weren't getting laid were very upset about it. So then monogamy was a way to like distribute,
equalize.
For lack of a better word, like the opportunity or the resources to the not as appealing prospects. Yeah.
Right.
And those poor guys.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, they were pissed off. That's like, so a bunch of wars were happening.
This is bullshit.
Yeah. They're like,
it was like almost everybody was an incel, basically. Right?
Yeah.
So,
incels don't even know we've created this whole system for them to be okay, and then they're still complaining. Yeah. It's like, dude, it could have been worse.
Right. So I think it's like, that's a real worry. Like if we had multiple partners, would we end up in that equilibrium again? So I guess I think like it's not at all clear to me how to construct a richer and I think like it would be good, like if you guys are interested in that, you should invite someone up here, who is into polyamory and is part of that like culture and has more experience, because I don't. Somebody who has like
It
I'm
scares
kind of
me.
hypothesizing, I
Yeah.
don't have like
Right. It's not your area of expertise. I lobbed a lot at you.
Well,
Yeah.
we're
Go ahead.
stand-up comics, so there's
Okay.
we've been at a number of open mics where comic like guys will come up and they'll be like, my girlfriend wants to be in an open relationship, and they're just so miserable.
They seem really sad. Yeah.
They're just very sad, and it's just like yeah. In terms of the in terms of the polyamory, I just think emotionally I could deal with that.
Well, and I think, dude, that's so interesting about the emotions of it too, because I think
Yeah.
instinctively when I think about it, when I hear that a woman wants to be with other guys outside of her partner, I think it's on a sexual level. You know what I mean? Because I think there's just this primal kind of insecurity that is strong in me. But then, like when you and Ezra Klein were talking about, you talked about it like on a more emotionally intimate level, where it's like that other partner could share a kind of language with your partner that you don't speak. And then that's where the real like jealousy and insecurity comes from. And I had that with a past partner, but this idea that they had this intimacy and this connection was really what kind of terrified me. And I really couldn't get past it. That was interesting to me too. Just that's what the root of jealousy can be, is just like, oh, I don't understand how they're talking, but I can tell it's significant. And that's driving me like crazy.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, I guess my thought was that there's something romantically significant about jealousy, such that if you have excluded jealousy from a monogamous relationship by way of the monogamy and by way of an understanding that everybody is going to behave, fully, like if you fully excluded it, then that's problematic, because jealousy is kind of erotic fuel in a certain way. But if you've sort of overcome jealousy via the polyamorous relation, right, and you're like, I'm totally okay with the fact that you're also in a relationship with her, that's also problematic for the exact same reason, because jealousy is the erotic fuel. And so that was just the thought, just to get back to your sort of question of why are these things exactly as problematic, it's because jealousy I think has to be a problem in a relationship. Like I think it's like the sort of project of, in some way, wanting to be everything for that person, and the impossibility of that, but I could imagine like that doesn't work in a monogamous relationship. I could sort of imagine it not working just as well in a polyamorous relationship, is what I say. So I don't have this thought like, oh, I could never imagine a polyamorous relationship because I would be so jealous. It's like, nah, exact same problem with monogamous. Like it'd be a problem. Like for me, it'd be a problem, but it's not a different sort of problem from the problem that I'm already in.
Right.
What's up, guys? I'm interrupting this podcast. Let you know once again that we are brought to you by us. We will be at the Hollywood Improv Main Room September 15th, Wednesday at 8 p.m. Get your tickets at hollywoodimprov.com. You do not want to miss the show. There's going to be some big names on the show. It's going to be epic. But we are also brought to you by Manscaped. Manscaped, what up? Thank you so much for keeping our trims peeled, for looking after our hogs, for making sure their dinks are looking fresh and clean, because school is back. And the Performance Package 4.0 from Manscaped is here to teach the boys a lesson on male hygiene. Inside, you'll find their Lawnmower 4.0 trimmer, Weed Whacker ear and nose hair trimmer, Crop Preserver ball deodorant, Crop Reviver toner, plus 2 free gifts, Performance boxer briefs, and the Shed travel bag. The Performance Package is super legit, so you guys want to check it out. Their 4th generation trimmer has cutting edge ceramic blade due to reduce grooming accidents thanks to their advanced skin safe technology. It has a 7,000 RPM motor, 4,000K LED spotlight, and the Weed Whacker for your friggin' nose, 9,000 RPM motor. I mean, you guys, you're going to get all the hair covered and trimmed nicely with Manscaped. So get 20% off plus free shipping with the code GODEEP at manscaped.com. That's 20% off plus free shipping with the code GODEEP at manscaped.com. This year, graduate with a degree in clean balls from Manscaped. We're also brought to you by the legends at Talkspace. Talkspace, thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast, guys. Therapy is crucial. Therapy is important. If you're feeling, overwhelmed, if you're feeling anxious, if you're feeling depressed, hit up the legends at Talkspace so they can talk you through it, because you can get matched with a licensed therapist today. It's super easy, super affordable. You do it through Zoom, so you can do it from the comfort of your own home. You don't have to drive to an office. It's much cheaper. It's so legit. And, if you're at a low point, if you're feeling alone, 50% of Americans struggle with mental health. So, there's no shame in asking for help. I do it. JT does it. We're big proponents of it. Check it out. I went to therapy recently. It was legit. Got me back on my feet. I was sprinting out and attacking the world in a good way after therapy. So check it out. They offer individual and couples therapy. In addition to medication prescription services, you can set goals with your therapist, and they can make sure you're really progressing. And thousands of licensed therapists are available for you to match with. So start feeling better with a single message. Match with a licensed therapist when you go to Talkspace.com. Get $100 off your first month with the promo code GODEEP. That's $100 off when you use code GODEEP at Talkspace.com. Finally, we are brought to you by DraftKings. You're going to get on that sweet, sweet action, baby. It's time to lay down a parlay or whatever you want to do and get on that sweet action, because the NFL is back. Now is the time to celebrate. The first NFL Sunday of the season is about to kick off, and DraftKings, the official daily fantasy partner of the NFL, is putting you in the center of this weekend's action. New customers can get a free shot at a $1 million top prize with their first deposit by signing up using code DEEP. Super simple. Just pick your lineup, stay under the salary cap, and see how your team stacks up against the competition. Feel the NFL action like never before with a free shot at $1 million payday. Download the DraftKings app now and use code DEEP. This week, new customers can get a free shot at the $1 million top prize and compete for millions in prizes across all contests. Enter code DEEP to get a free shot at the $1 million top prize with your first deposit. That's code DEEP. Only at DraftKings, the official daily fantasy partner of the NFL. Minimum $5 deposit required. Eligibility restrictions apply. See DraftKings.com for details. Finally, we are brought to you by our merch. Check out our beer bongs, everything at shopcgd.com. It's all good stuff. Back to the show.
Just changing directions. You were talking about a meritocracy, and there's so much conversation about that now, about like, because I think a lot of people, and with good reason, like kind of are skeptical of a meritocracy, that it could ever exist with like equal rewards for people on similar achievement, if that makes sense. But I like what you said about it, like not having a punitive meritocracy, because to me that's always been the thing that kind of was a hiccup for me thinking about it, was that I was like, I don't like it when people say like successful people are only successful because they cheated to get there, or because they did like that feels like a kind of overly reductive. But then I also don't like a system where people are like, oh, this person didn't achieve values that are society kind of rewards, but that's because they're like not good, or because they didn't try.
Yeah, maybe one way to put it is that the idea of a non-punitive meritocracy is an idea that combines the right to praise for those who succeed with the right to complain for those who fail.
Right.
So
that sounds
it's
perfect.
like it's like you want to be able to say of the people who succeed, like, congratulations, but you want to honor them, at least, like, maybe not honor them beyond all reasonable amount, the way that we do with actors or whatever, but at least a reasonable amount of honoring them, because I don't think that people can achieve much without actually trying and actually putting effort into it, so they deserve some honor. But on the other hand, I think, like, look, everybody wants to achieve stuff. So the people who fail, it's like the idea that, like, oh, well, they just didn't want it enough, or they didn't try hard enough. Like, no, there isn't a person who doesn't want the good. Like, that's not a human possibility. And so if they, yes, of course, it could be that they, like, in some ways didn't put enough effort in, but that's going to itself be a function of the kind of environment that they were in, and the kind of opportunities they had, and the kind of responses people made to the efforts that they put in. And I want those people to be able to, in some sense, hook onto those features and be like, why didn't this work out for me? Partly in the mode of, like, actually asking the question,
Mm.
where like that question almost becomes forbidden if you're so prone to blame, right? It's like, well, it's your fault. You brought it on yourself. That's a way of shutting down a certain question. So I think the way a lot of people view it is that, like, in order to avoid blame as a failure person, I have to blame the successful person, so that you purchase the right to complain by blaming the other group. And each side feels that they purchase the right of the thing they want, to either to get the praise or to complain, by like denying that to the other side. And I think, no, we can just have a system that includes both praise for successes and the right to complain for people who fail.
Right. Yeah, so it is a little bit more acceptable within that kind of idea for the group that's lacking to complain. And that's why it's a little more off-putting when the group that is successful complains, because you're like, but shouldn't you have a little bit more like kind of grace about this because of your station?
Yes, and I think what happens is that when you're not in that non-punitive meritocracy that I described, but you're in a kind of punitive one, the people who succeed feel a need to dress up their success as a kind of failure in order to elicit sympathy, right? Which is like a little bit like playing the leveling game, like, yes, I had it so hard, right?
Yeah, like even Paris Hilton has a documentary now on Netflix about how difficult her teen years were. And I was on a date with someone and I was like, I don't know if I have the bandwidth to afford empathy towards Paris Hilton's upbringing, which seemed kind of cruel on my part. But at the same time, I was like, there's people way worse off. So like, what does she expect?
Well, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle too.
Yo, they're perfect. Yeah.
Yeah. During peak COVID, they're like, we're gonna go on Oprah and complain about our lives.
Right. Yeah. So I think this is super. And another thing which is super interesting is, like, I think in general we are far too we like police complaint more than we should. Right. So on the one hand, like, if you have a kind of messed up meritocracy, it's either messed up because you are blaming the failures or because you're blaming the successes. Then you're going to create bad incentives, right? And so in particular, in a situation where you're blaming the successes, you're creating incentives for the success people to describe themselves as failures so that they can get the thing that's valuable in that system, which is like sympathy. And then what that does is it generates a general suspicion of requests for sympathy, right? Which I think is super corrosive at a human level. That is, I think what we want is a world in which anytime anyone is expressing suffering of any kind, we're ready and willing to, like, believe them and trust that they're suffering. And suffering takes a lot of different forms, right? And rich people can suffer too. But I think so like the natural human response to suffering is to empathize and to in some sense not require the sufferer to show their credentials like of being sufficiently sufferer, right? And so I think it's really like almost like trickle down effects from the toxic meritocracy that then creates a empathy Olympics, right? Where in order to earn your empathy, you have to put down someone else as like not really deserving it as much as you do. Like, I deserve more empathy because look at Meghan Markle, she's married to a royal. So, I secure my place in your giving me empathy by putting down somebody else.
So do you almost think that sympathy game is so that's what you're saying, that the sympathy game is a corrective to the toxic meritocracy that we're in?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, a simpler way to think about it is like, the one version of the punitive meritocracy, which I do think tends to be more the version that we're in, which is the successful people are evil version of it. That version of it then, creates this new currency in effect, failure, suffering. You can't sort of show off that you succeeded because that actually makes you bad, right? So what can you show off is like, well, that you are suffering, right? And so in effect, like, I think striking the right balance, and it's difficult to get that balance of like,
it's impossible, I think.
Maybe, but we can at least have it as a goal, right?
Let's strive for it. Yeah.
And a mark of achieving it would be that we would be doing a lot less calculation in terms of like, well, does she really deserve the empathy because she suffered more? You know what it's like? It's like in a relationship, when things are going well, you're not like counting how many things the other person did for you, right? Like if someone does something nice for you, you're like, awesome, and you do nice things for them, and you're not like trying to make sure that they're like the even amount, right? And when that is happening, when you're like calculating, something has gone wrong. I think similarly, when we're doing these sorts of calculations of like, well, does so-and-so really deserve to complain since like she's married to a royal, and right, that's a sign that in a larger dynamic, something has gone wrong.
Right.
In the comedy world, I have a hard time if we have like a, if JT and I have like a career success or whatever, I don't want to tell anyone about it. What do you think that is? Like, and I think a lot of it is, I don't want them to dislike me. And what do you think in sort of our comedic meritocracy world? What do you think is creates that within me? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense to me. I think that, I mean, first of all, we have really strict norms against showing off.
Right.
And so you don't want to be seen as showing off is like a big thing, right?
Yeah. Because I do want to tell them, but I don't.
You want them to know.
I want them to know, not through me.
Exactly.
That's what it
right?
is.
I'll tell them.
So
yeah, JT will do it. He's no problem telling people.
That's why it's nice having a partner. Yeah.
So I think often it's like, it's not that we don't want them to know. We do want them to know, but we don't want to be the one to tell, because the speech act of telling is easily read as showing off, and showing off is read as like an attempt at like dominance or aggression or whatever, right? And so you want people to think that you're awesome, but you don't want people to feel like you're making a claim on their recognition of your awesomeness.
Right.
Yeah. That's so good. Wait, what was I gonna say? Shit. All right, well, I'll just pivot. You also talked about what like a left-leaning version of Jordan Peterson would look like, because it doesn't seem like there's an equal figure in that, or maybe there is, but I might just be oblivious to him. But it doesn't seem to be as culturally impactful in the circles that I run in.
One thing I think I said to Ezra is that Jordan Peterson mobilizes a lot of egalitarian sentiment to great effect, right? So he is playing the leveling game way more than he's playing the status game.
Oh, wow, really?
Absolutely. So he is speaking to people and addressing people who, the part of people that where they feel a bit like failures, right? He's not addressing the part that where they feel like successes. And what he's saying is like, look, you can have a kind of self-respect, right? And it's not dependent on your being above other people. And I think that's what makes Jordan Peterson so effective, is precisely that he is, though he's on the right, and you might have associated the right more with the status game, he's actually much more playing the leveling game. And he even is doing it himself, right? He's somehow, I feel he's a person with whom people empathize. His travails, like in the past few years with his, he suffered a lot. It's evident that he's really suffered. He is somehow, he doesn't have a tone of superiority at all, which is quite remarkable, actually. He's very relatable somehow. So I think that, in a way, if you were constructing someone on the left, what you'd want is somebody actually who mobilizes status really well, despite having a lot of egalitarian principles, right?
Yeah.
I think that's what you'd want. And like, how does someone do that? I almost feel like, well, you have to watch someone do it before you could see how it could be done really effectively. But because I think, one of the problems with being a kind of egalitarian is like, but everyone wants to be special too, and like be in some way better than other people. And that's a very, very deep thing in all of us, right? But I'm not sure.
No, but that's so interesting, because like the instruction that he gives that I always think of when I think of him is that he says, make your bed. And that's something that like no one's gonna see. You know what I mean? You're doing that for your own,
and everyone can do it.
And everyone can do it. And it's all for your own personal like self-worth, and it's not contingent on other people. And then so what you're kind of saying is that the left-wing version of that would have to like kind of appropriate the values of the other side to make it as equally appealing.
Yeah, like maybe you can be way more anti-racist than other people or something. I'm not
Right.
sure.
That was
Right.
I think that was what you mentioned on Ezra, and I was like, oh,
Yeah,
but I guess I was just kind of like, oh, but I don't want to do that because that feels a little inauthentic to me. You know what I
I
mean?
agree.
Although
So
of course I strive to anti-racism. You know, I think that is in me, but to lead with that or
to
to
make
try to
to make a competition out of it, right? I
yeah,
agree. Like I don't think it's a great, like it's sort of like, look, I mean, if somebody figured this out, they'd be like a genius and it would be amazing. And so I can't just like the idea that I could produce it out of my own head, right? I'm producing a caricatured version of it.
right.
So
That's
you'd
true.
have
I'm
to
sorry. I didn't mean yeah.
actually, oh no, it's totally fine as a question, but I think it's like you'd have to really actually do this effectively in the way that Jordan Peterson does it effectively, where you actually have to make people feel like this is like a legitimate source of honor in a certain way.
And I guess there's already so many people competing for the anti-racism title that it feels a bit oversaturated. And I feel very out of place throwing myself into that. There's people who do it better than me. Yeah.
The painting on your wall behind you says no room for racism.
Yeah, my dad bought this for me in Mexico because he said it
Oh.
reminded him of me. And it says no room for racism on it. And I thought that was why he said it reminded him of me. But people since then have said it just looks like me. And that's
It actually does kind of look like you.
and that's probably more why he picked it. Yeah, I have offset eyes. So I think I was picking the part that I thought was more me, but now I just couldn't see my face. Yeah.
That's funny.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we'd love to answer some questions with you right now from our listeners. But before we do that, I'd love to kind of get again your perspective on advice and how that's kind of intrinsic in podcasting.
Yeah. So, I mean, I was really referring to something. I think my sort of objections to advice extend beyond podcasting, but I was referring to something specific that happens in podcasts, which is people are asked for advice to how to become like them. You know, like Margaret Atwood, I talk about Margaret Atwood, right? And people are like, so if people want to become a writer, like what should they do? And like, you know, should they spend a few years teaching grammar the way you did? And should they go and live in another country for a few years? And like, oh, should they? And she's like, they should write every day. And then she's like, not that I do that, but you know, and so there are like things that sound good. Like if you're asked like how to become a writer, there are things that sort of sound like the things that you say to other people asking you how to become a writer, like write every day. But those things are like, they're not being said because there's any reason to believe they would turn someone into a writer. They're being said because there's like just a currency of like what we say in these contexts.
And there's
like,
safe platitudes too. It won't get anyone in trouble to do that. Like sometimes people ask me for advice and I'll give advice that's totally opposite of what I actually did. But I know that my road was so fraught with mistakes that negatively impacted me and other people that I'm like, I can't recommend that to other people. Like that's like gonna, I don't know what would happen if I did. So I just kind of take yeah.
So I think that's a great point. And I think this gets to something deeper that was bugging me, but I never articulated in that piece, which is that so one thing I do say is like, if you just look at the trajectory of someone like Margaret Atwood, it's like super, super weird. And, you know, she did this like teaching grammar to like people in some military base or something for a while. And like, you know, like the people just do all kinds of random stuff, right? And when she did all that random stuff, she wasn't like trying to like do something that someone else did first, right? She was kind of just living her life. And she took, you know, in effect, took a bunch of risks too that like paid off in her case. And it's like, you would never recommend any of that. But if people didn't take a bunch of risks where they weren't sure they were going to pay off, they wouldn't become Margaret Atwood. But you can never recommend those risks, right? And so somehow the path that ends up getting recommended is like this kind of boilerplate that's like couldn't actually get anyone to succeed, and I feel like promotes a kind of risk aversion that's in a way noxious.
Yeah, it's like Seinfeld said. He wrote every day. You mark off on your calendar, like I wrote for an hour a day. And I used to follow that. I like took that advice. I was like, that's what I need to do, you know? And then, but through trial and error, you sort of learn your own system, your own method of like being a comedian. And then looking back on it, you know, that's a good thing to do probably. But, you know, in terms of becoming a good comedian, there's so many other factors that are at play. And it's like, that you just have to learn for yourself of just like living life and learning how to, interpret what happens to you in a comedic way. But you can't, Seinfeld can't really say that, I guess. But yeah, that's, yeah.
Yeah, it feels like a lot of the most important stuff somehow can't be conveyed efficiently, let's say.
Let's answer some cues. X moving back. What up, legends and babes? Just found Fruit Smash. Fruit Smash is this seltzer that I drank a bunch of during this. That sponsors us at the grocery store today, and it hit the spot while my current stoke tank the last few days has been down bad, tremendous. Got T-boned last week, and my dirt nasty Subi is in op. To add to the bad week, I just found out from a schmoll. A schmoll is we have like our own kind of vocabulary for this stuff. A schmoll is someone in the friend group that no one likes, but you can't get rid of because they're basically a good person, but they just don't ever fit the vibe. So this guy found out from that person that his ex, who moved away last August, is now moving back. To keep it short, she told me she loved me first, which is huge to me. This took 6 months of dating, but she has worked for me for the previous 2 years on and off. I piped her down at work one day. Sorry. Was a fantasy I was able to X off. Anyways, I know she is bad for me, but I don't know how to keep her and her return off my mind. Our chemistry is unmatched, but I don't think I'd ever change who she is at heart. She loves to do full sends and would do lines all night from a 6-foot COVID straw. Oh, strong lung capacity. Do I ignore her return, try to say what up, or just let shit flow? I hate that I always think of her. Thanks for the insight and mega stoked if this hits the pod. Fuck Puzio. Puzio's a guy I fought freshman year of high school at a football game. I liked your husband's perspective on fighting too, that he said the guy who would go the is it the furthest or the farthest would be the victor.
Most damage.
Yeah, the one who would stick his fingers in someone else's eyes.
Yeah. But I do jujitsu, and I don't know if that's always true on a certain level of skill.
Yeah, but I think this was not a high level. This was high school kids fighting each other without training. So, okay. So basically, this guy's ex is moving back into town, and he knows he's going to be attracted to her, but he thinks they're going to fall into the same bad dynamic, and he's not going to change her, but he's going to probably have the illusion that he can change her. And he might enjoy sleeping with her, but that's not going to be no strings attached. It's going to, from his point of view, it's going to involve an emotional investment that can turn into, that he sort of foresees turning into a net negative.
Yes.
That's how I hear what this guy's saying.
Well put.
So I almost feel like in these situations, sometimes you take a predictive stance towards yourself. You're just like, yeah, I know I'm going to get involved with her.
Oh, wow.
Like you can.
Oh, you're telling him just to go with it. Just, yeah.
Oh, no, I'm not telling him that. I'm saying like, it's not.
That's what you tell yourself in your mind.
Yeah, like what I'm saying is like you can have all these things where you tell yourself like, what am I going to do? But like on some deeper level, you also have this predictive stance where you're just like, what is actually going to happen? Am I like in control of this process? At least in my case, when I've been in something like this situation, it's like, it's been a situation where at the deep level of my brain, what was happening was the predictive stance and not the choosing stance. And there's a way in which, like, when you're in the predictive stance, advice is irrelevant, right? Because you're not choosing. I think often, like in that situation, you can only make meta choices. Like you can't, like, you're not always going to be able to decide how to manage a given interaction, but like maybe you can figure out ways to like prevent interactions, right?
Right.
But on the deeper level, like if your brain has taken the predictive stance and it wants those interactions, like it's going to find a work.
He's definitely going to do this. Yeah, I think that's what I'm getting to. But is there a way, like you talked about in Eric Weinstein's podcast, which was super interesting. I liked when you guys kind of towards the last 20 minutes, it almost looked like yeah, but it almost seemed performative on his part. I almost thought he was just like, I'm going to perform anger as a way to spice up. Or did you feel it was real anger?
He was angry.
You guys remain so even keeled, and it's so articulate that it's hard to discern. Was that uncomfortable for you, or you're able to just kind of sit in that and stick to your guns?
It was interesting, I would say. Like I was like, not every podcast happens that someone gets angry at you. So I think I was not indifferent to the emotional aspect of it at all. Like I was
interesting
by it. But I thought like I don't know. I sort of respected it in the sense that it felt real, and he was like giving me a real response to, this feeling like he wanted me to be indignant about what happened to his brother. And I was not being indignant, and that like genuinely upset him. And it's not, so I feel like there was something like, it was almost like throughout that podcast, we were having a bit of trouble relating to one another, like even speaking the same, it was an interesting podcast, but we weren't quite speaking the same language. And it was almost like we ended up in this emotional language where we were communicating.
Oh, wow, that's so
as
nice.
Like we found
you found common ground.
Yeah, in anger. So I thought I think as a kind of performative thing, it was just interesting.
Well, I've been on dates where I'm not connecting with someone, and then I've just towards like an hour and a half in on like the third date, I'm like, why don't I just get combative? Because maybe that'll provide some energy between us, which is really what I'm pursuing.
Yeah, I totally do that with people like all the time.
Right.
In a sense, picking fights in order to have an emotional connection. I think people do it on Twitter all the time. It's a big part of what people are doing, is like seeking emotional connection by picking fights.
Yeah.
But sorry, you were going to ask something, but I where was this?
Oh, right. Sorry. I guess it's so at the beginning of your guys' podcast together, you talked about Odysseus strapping himself to the mast of the sail, or whatever the terminology is, so that he could listen to the songs of the sirens, where everybody else, if they hear it, they go nuts and they just go straight into it, and it ends up being their death. But he found a kind of way around it, where he just had his homies tie him up so that he couldn't get loose, but he could still hear it, which for some reason to me is like the best thing you can do. Like, I just love that. But is there a way that this guy can do that so that he doesn't fall into destructive temptation?
Yeah. I had a friend who used to he was really trying not to overeat, and he would he'd buy all these cookies, and then he would lock them in the trunk of his car. But then in the middle of the night, he would come down and open his car. So there's I guess I think the most effective control mechanisms of that kind tend to involve other people. Right. Because if it's like a thing you can unlock, you'll just unlock it later. So yes, you can set other people against you. I think you can tell your friends, like, if you see me go near her, pull me in the other direction, don't let me text her, etc. I think you can say that. Like, there's a question, is he actually going to do it? Like, if somebody, if he really wants to get back together with her, then he's not going to tell that to his friends, right? I think one thing that's problematic about these scenarios of weakness of will, where someone is saying, I don't think it's good for me to get back together with her, but I'm strongly inclined to, is I never feel totally sure which part of the person I should identify with. Like, the person is telling me to identify with the self that says, I don't want to get back together with her. And they're sort of dictating that to me, right? And they're like, that's the real me. The real me is the self that doesn't want to get back together with her. And then I have these desires for her, right? But I'm like, well, am I going to trust you? What if the real you is the one that wants to get back together with her? What if the real you is the one that wants the cookies? The real you is the one that doesn't want the cookies, but
well, I guess it's just which real
who am I advising? Which of you am I advising is the question.
Well, I guess I just take the stance of advise the real you that's not going to fuck your life up. You know what I mean? And it feels like the real you, even though that the realer him is probably the one that is going to do this, but I feel like that one is not the one I should be advising, because that feels like it could have more negative consequences for his life.
I mean, the question of what constitutes a negative consequence, though, is going to be answered differently by the different parts of himself, right? So you're really on one team here. You're on team prudence, right?
Yeah.
And
isn't that the better one, though?
I mean, is it we don't know what, there's probably some reason why we don't always find ourselves on that team. And do you know people who are always on that team and they're super boring? So no, I don't think we should always be on that team. I think that I do think that there's a question of how destructive you should be with your life, but the answer isn't 0, I think. I in a way, the thing that's more worrisome is the thought, this is a cycle that I've been through and I'm going to go through it again and it's going to be exactly the same. And it's less than the destructiveness part than it's the repetitiveness of that.
It's not going to provide new epiphanies.
The chances for growth are not there.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's the thing to tell yourself. Like, if you really want to persuade yourself, it's like, think about the ways in which this will all just be what already happened. And like, you'll be reliving the past. And is that who you want to be? And I think you can make that pretty unattractive to yourself. And then that can potentially be persuasive to the other you. But I think you ultimately have to persuade that other part of yourself. You can't just try to shut it down, lock it in a trunk, etc., because you'll just unlock the trunk.
So going back to Team Prudence, like, are you saying that we should explore those avenues sometimes to see, just to see for ourselves? Or like, for example, I'm trying to quit vaping. But I asked my brother to hold me accountable, just to like call me every day. I don't even know where I was going with this, but
you wanted to ask about like Team Prudence and like, should we should we do bad things or not?
Right.
Am I suggesting that we should do bad things?
Yeah. Should we explore that to make our lives a little more interesting, or to learn more from experience? Like, is there a road too cautious?
I think definitely, yes, there's definitely a too cautious road. And like, it depends like what part of your life you're in. Like, I think there are many times of life where people gravitate more towards caution than anything else. People, I'm 45, people my age are, I would say, under self-destructive, like, that I know. But I think that like it depends. It's sort of like there's an exploratory approach to life that can pay some really big dividends, but it opens you to being in some way dominated by your impulses, and some of those impulses are really destructive. And so it's hard to be like, like, there's a certain kind of speech that we give to ourselves so often of like, don't be impulsive, be prudent, right? Where that's really often the right speech to give, but we give it to ourselves so many times that we associate that with who we really are. Whereas really it's just a kind of authoritarian voice over ourselves, right? And so the question is like, how to be exploratory and kind of open about your life without being sort of prey to your impulses. And I don't know the answer to that, but I guess the thing is like, I do know that like a certain framing of, well, here's an option that I know is bad for me, but I might give into it. And like, you ask someone for advice, right? It's like, well, you already sound like you know what you think you should do, and you also sound like you're not going to do it. And like, what is this dynamic? What are we doing here with this advice, right? And what like one thing one can do is like question this whole framing. Like, you've told me some things about this woman, right? You haven't told me everything, right? You've told me a particular story. And so like, ask yourself, why have you framed the story in this way, where like there's the real me, and like the real me knows she's bad for me, and then there's like the evil me, and like, should I listen to the evil me or not? So like, you're asking, right? And I'm like, I'm starting to like wonder about whether all this framing is itself kind of, you're trying to work yourself up into something.
Right. It's almost like if we were to tell this guy like, don't get back with your ex, you're going to regret it. It's just going to be the same thing that's happening before. It's going to come up, but it's almost like, and I think this is the case with like alcoholics too, who want to go back out and drink. Sometimes people in AA will say, well, go learn for yourself. You need to, you obviously, maybe there are some instances where people just need to learn through experience that this is not beneficial for them, so that
or maybe they didn't need to, but
lives.
That's how it goes. It's like like that is it's really hard to know what needed to happen, right? It's like, that's a story we tell retrospectively, like Margaret Atwood saying like, oh yeah, I taught grammar for these years, and did that need to happen? Like, one only knows that it did happen, and then they that taught them that was
Yeah.
like, I hit rock bottom, and then I was able to transform myself. And like, if that was a person I loved, like, and they were alcoholic, I probably would really, really do a lot to try to prevent them from drinking. But I'm not sure that any of that is the same as me giving them advice not to drink. Like,
Right.
the advice sort of seems to float free.
Right. Kind of, and sometimes at a superficial level where it's pretty basic. I guess for me, when I'm giving advice, I try to take into account, and it's hard with these emails because they're brief, but I'm just like, all right, is this person like, if there are a person who seems too controlled by their impulses, like they're kind of Pinocchio and someone else has the strings and that's their impulses, I'm like, all right, well, let's push this person towards prudence. But if they feel like they're overly prudent, then I'm like, all right, well, like fuck your life up a little bit, because it's just really about finding that sweet spot, which is basically impossible in life, I've discovered, for myself at least, because I'm just kind of extreme. But I'm like, all right, what direction does this person need to get nudged? And with this guy, I feel like I just guessing, I don't think he needs any new information. I don't think he's going to get new epiphanies from being with this person again. I think your better course of action is to see if you can resist it, and then see if you gain kind of new power and knowledge of yourself in that process. But that's also based off who I am, which is typically the person who does the thing you're not supposed to, and then tries to glean and then retroactively is like, oh, but I learned a lot. But I don't even know sometimes if I'm learning. Yeah.
I mean, one thing that just struck me about this letter is it seems so obvious that he thinks that's the correct advice.
Right. Yeah. He doesn't
So
want to do it.
why are you asking for advice if you already know what the right advice is, but you don't want to do it? Like, well, you're not more likely to do it if you hear the thing that you already thought was the right thing to do, right?
Yeah.
So it's sort of like, I think you're totally right that this is written in such a way as to produce the response, stay away from her. That
right.
very
He wants
thing
to hear that.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, and maybe it's useful, maybe it was useful for him to hear that. That's clearly what he wants to hear.
I love the kind of meta-analysis on it. I think it's brilliant. All right, here's the next question. Non-horny girlfriend, eternally grateful if you answered. Chad, JT, Aaron, and any lovely guest. I've been with my girlfriend for 5 lovely years. We got together in college, then lived solo distance for 2-ish, and are now capable of moving in together post-pandemic because of cheap apartment prices and lack of COVID. Sick. That said, you've covered jerking off while living with a girlfriend in a previous pod, which I appreciate. But what is a dude supposed to do when a girlfriend is straight up not in the mood to actually bang? I'd agree dudes are more horny than girls, but like sometimes they feel insecure that she isn't as into me as I am to her. I'm assuming this will happen when we move in based on our visiting experiences so far. I'm too tired. We can tomorrow. He's using those as like blanket kicking the can down the roads that she gives him. Do I take this as an insult? Are girls just less horny, or am I just looking too much into it? Just want to make sure I'm not moving in with the girlfriend and potentially fiance and accepting the non-bone life. And PS, how can I get her to initiate? Please keep it on. We're both pod fans.
Okay, good. Interesting. I mean, there were like several ways that he posed the problem here. Like early on, I thought it was going to be a question about like, how do you masturbate when there's someone else around? But then it sort of took this turn of like, how do I deal with the fact that she wants less sex than I do? How do I get her to want more sex?
It feels like the baseline is, how do I get my girlfriend to desire me as much as I desire her?
But there's another level of, how do I get myself not to be upset by, like, and to read into, etc. Right? Because it's like, okay, they've been together, but they haven't been living together, right? So he has, and assuming they haven't been sleeping with other people, he's not going to have less sex, right, in this scenario than he had before. But it's more like he might notice the having less sex more, right? So it's like, it's a question about it's coming to bother him, right? Like, because it's like it should be a possibility since she's there. I think this is like a real and serious and profound issue in like most relationships. To be like, I think the one thing I would tell this guy is like, most people have this problem. It's not the gender dynamic does not always work that way. It's not always the man who wants more sex, but it's like, I think it's actually like, from people I know, it's kind of rare that both people in the couple want the same amount of sex.
They're on equal levels, right?
Yeah. So like, this is like a real, like, it's like a real problem with marriage. People like, And it kind of, there are all kinds of ways in which a couple might not be on the same page in terms of like, I'm way messier than like most people, including my husband, but really anyone. I'm, like one person in the couple might want to eat one kind of food, another. So all kinds of ways in which people's basic nature might not coordinate with another person. But the sexual one, I think, is the one that really poses a problem. We read into sex, we symbolically idealize it, and we interpret it as a sign or as a mark of like how much the person loves you, how good the relationship is, how much they're attracted to you, how much they care about you, how much they value about you. All of that gets packed into sexuality in a way that it doesn't for like whether or not they clean or something. So I guess the first thing I would say is like I think it's it makes a lot of sense to me that he has this worry. And one thing is like he shouldn't, it's like it could just be that's one of the worries that's baked into coming to live with someone, is having to come to negotiate this. And maybe it's not obvious to me that you can sort of know in advance how that's going to work. Or even that if you get it to work, it will keep working and you won't have to like deal with the problem again, like 5 years down the line.
Right. Yeah, it's well said. It's good stuff. I think you're right too. I think we all read into that too much. You know what I mean? We don't understand that someone's just baseline or someone's kind of just relationship to sex is different than our own. We think that if it's different than our own, it's kind of a poor reflection of our sexual
they lost attraction,
aptitude or ability to seduce and stuff like that, which hits hard. But I guess if I was giving him like a way to go about it to get to that place where you guys are on a similar level, I would just be, without being overly inquisitive and without putting pressure on it, I would just try to find out what works for her, so that explore all those options and see if there is a way to kind of I don't know, just better understand each other. Because even if it doesn't lead to more sex, if you can better understand her through her preferences and through her eroticism, maybe you'll also understand that maybe it's just not on the same level as your own.
I think one thing to think about is why he hasn't done that already, in effect, right? Like just to think about it himself, is he already knows about this discrepancy in their sexual appetites, right? And so like, it'd be interesting to know what stands in the way. Is it just that he sort of doesn't want to have a conversation, or is it that he knows what it would be, but he doesn't want to do it?
I just don't think he's asked. I think he's probably just really young and he's just horny and he's just like, hey, let's have sex all the time. And she's like, hey, like that route doesn't really work for me. But that's my
yeah, I like that. I think that's more insightful actually than the thing I said. And I think maybe another thing to think of would be like, maybe to think in terms of like of sex as more extended and including something like seduction, right? So it's like, there's a project of seduction that goes along with sex. And maybe if you see each other very infrequently, that seduction element, the work of that is done by like the fact that you've been longing for each other all this time, so that this, but like in the context where you're around each other, you have to like recreate that distance somehow, right? And so he may have to like think about seduction for the first time. I've been on both sides. Like I've been in situations where I was the one who wanted more sex, and I was in a situation where I was the one who wanted less sex, and like they're both just really, really hard.
They're both painful as fuck. Yeah. Like
I think it's like incredibly hard not to read into that, like the telling yourself whatever, like my experience doesn't work at all. And so you actually have to deal with the problem, I think, rather than trying to like tell yourself that it actually isn't important, because I think it just is super important.
Nice. All right. Well, I think that's it.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah,
it was really fun. I've never talked so much about sex on a podcast. So that was super fun for me. Nobody ever asked me to talk about sex.
Well, I think you were wonderfully insightful. And if you're ever in Los Angeles, we'd love to have you on the podcast in person. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome.
Yeah.
I'll keep that in mind.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Have a good night. Bye.
Boom, bap, boom, bap, boom, bap, boom, bap, boom, bap. Hand me the screw. What is your beef of the week? Aaron, who's your beef of the week? Strider, who's your legend of the week? Joe, what's your quote of the week?